Hello, in today's video, we're going to be replacing the spark plugs on this 2003 Toyota Tacoma with the 3.4 liter engine. So that means we're going to have 6 spark plugs to replace. And before we begin, you will notice that this particular engine recommends that we use twin ground electrode plugs, so that is what we're going to be using. So we went ahead and purchased 6 NGK3967 plugs, which are copper core plugs. And if we open them up, we do got our twin ground electrodes, as we should be using. Well, now that we got the plugs, let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we're going to do is disconnect the negative terminal of the battery using a 10mm socket. Once we got it loosened up, just remove the terminal and move it off to the side. To give us more room to work with, we're going to remove this intake tube, which is held on by 2 clamps that we'll be using the same 10mm socket to loosen them with by rotating them counterclockwise. Once they're loose, let's pull off and disconnect this hose back here, followed by these wire guides, tilting them back so the tab is able to slide out. Now this second one. Normally I disconnect this hose here, but if you notice cracks on the hose, they're going to get worse. So I'll check the other end to see if this one's safe to remove. Which good thing that this end's not cracked, so I'll pull off the hose from here instead. Well, let's go ahead and pull off our intake tube, disconnecting it from the throttle body first, followed by disconnecting it from the airbox side. And with that, we can pull off this intake tube, well, after unhooking this hose, that is. By doing this, we clear up this whole side to give us easy access to these spark plugs. And we're going to be starting with the cylinder 1 spark plug. The first thing we'll do is disconnect the connector to the ignition coil by pressing on this tab up here as we slide out the connector. If it's a little hard to disconnect, it may help to push it in first before pulling it back. And here's a better look at the tab we're pressing in on, which tilts up the lower part, allowing us to disconnect it. Once disconnected, we'll loosen and remove the bolt holding the ignition coil using a 10mm socket. After removing the bolt, just slide out the ignition coil like so, and move it off to the side. To remove the spark plugs, particularly on this side, I'll be using a 5/8 spark plug socket plus a 6-inch extension. And what makes these sockets meant for spark plugs is that they got a rubber insert to hold the plugs as you remove them and install them. Some of these sockets use magnets instead of the rubber insert, but they do the same task. Now for the actual spark plug, we'll guide the socket down the spark plug tube. Once it's grabbing the spark plug, we'll loosen it by rotating it counterclockwise. Once it's loose, we should be able to remove it the rest of the way by hand. Once it's off the threads, we can remove it and take a look at it. Well, it had the proper spark plugs, and seems like it hasn't been that long since they've been replaced, but we'll be replacing them nevertheless. To prepare our new spark plugs, we're going to want to check the gap and also add a little bit of anti-seize to the threads. Although these spark plugs do come pre-gapped, it's still always best to at least check them. So we'll grab our spark plug gap tool and we locate our .044 sized wire. Now we'll check the space between the center electrode and the outer ground electrodes. And we're going to want the wire to barely fit between, lightly rubbing against them like it does on this one. This other side is a little tight, but still fairly close. It's still allowing the wire through. And in the case that you did have to readjust the gap, you'll use these adjusters, finding the one that fits the outer electrode best, placing it in between like so, and either tilt it away if you need to adjust the gap wider, or tilt it forward if you need to adjust the gap tighter. But the gaps on this one are fine as is. Now we're going to add a little anti-seize to the plugs to help make them easier to remove the next time that we got to replace them. And all we do here is just add a small amount to the first few threads. This will coat the remaining threads as we tighten the plug. With this one done, we just repeat that for the remaining 5 plugs. Well, let's go ahead and install our new spark plug, getting the plug in by hand as far as it goes. Then tighten the plug down with the ratchet. Final torquing it to 14 foot-pounds. Although anti-seize does affect the torque value, so I do about 12 foot-pounds. With the spark plug on and torqued, let's get the ignition coil back on, plus the bolt, threading it on by hand first, then snug it up with the ratchet. These bolts are small and going into aluminum, so you don't want to tighten these too much. And now just reconnect the connector till it clicks. Continuing on to our number 3 spark plug. Disconnect the connector, loosen and remove the bolt, remove the coil, now loosen and remove the spark plug. And this plug's not so bad either. Reinstall our new spark plug by hand first, then tighten and torque it. Reinstall the ignition coil, the bolt, and the connector. And on to our number 5 spark plug. Once again, we'll start with the connector, followed by the ignition coil held on by its bolt. Loosen and remove it. And now loosen and remove the spark plug as well. As with the others, this one's pretty good as well. Well, let's reinstall the new spark plug. Then torque it down. Reinstall the ignition coil plus the bolt. And lastly, reconnect this connector. Completing this whole bank of spark plugs. For these driver side plugs, we will have some obstacles to deal with. So for now, I'm going to loosen and remove this bolt that holds the ground straps using a 10mm socket. We're going to be starting with our cylinder number 2 spark plug. For these, we're going to need to pull out the spark plug wires, and we'll do this by grabbing the 2 tabs and pulling the wire up and off. For this whole bank of spark plugs, we're going to be adding a 1-foot extension to our original setup. This is going to help make removing them a lot easier. With our new setup, we'll maneuver it into the spark plug tube, then loosen and remove the spark plug. And this spark plug's in pretty good shape too. Placing our new spark plug in the socket, then reinstall it by hand first before torquing it to spec. Guide the spark plug wire back into the tube and onto the spark plug, pushing down till you hear or feel it click. Before removing the 4th cylinder wire, we're going to remove this bolt that holds on this bracket using a 10mm socket. Once that's out of the way, we can pull out the spark plug wire, guiding it out of the way. Placing our spark plug socket with extension into the tube and onto the spark plug, then loosen and remove the spark plug. And this plug is also in pretty good shape too. Reinstall a new spark plug, then thread it in by hand and torque it. And now the spark plug wire. Now for our sixth and final cylinder spark plug, I remove this bracket, which has one bolt up here that will use a 12mm short socket to loosen it. And it'll also have one bolt down here that I'll use a 14mm socket to loosen and remove it. With this lower bolt completely off, let's remove the upper one entirely as well. Moving the bracket with the wiring that's clipped onto it out of the way. And with that out of the way, it gives us a little extra room to work with. Let's pull off the spark plug wire, then guide the tool onto the spark plug, then loosen and remove it. Now this is one spark plug with signs of an issue. There's unburned fuel on this plug, signifying a possible misfire. Guess we'll investigate that after this video. Now install a new spark plug by hand first, and torque it to spec. Reinstall the spark plug wire till it clicks in, completing our spark plugs. Let's now reinstall everything that we removed, starting with this bracket plus the bolts. Loosely install the top bolt first. This will help us guide and install a lower bolt since we can't really see it from here. With both of those bolts in, let's go ahead and tighten them. Install this cable bracket plus this bolt, placing the cable back onto the bracket if it came off. Followed by these ground straps plus the bolt, then tighten that one as well. Reinstall the intake tube, placing it on the airbox side first, then onto the throttle body. Once it's on properly, we'll tighten both clamps, reinsert the guides, followed by reconnecting both hoses. Now with everything back on, all we got left to do is reconnect the negative battery terminal and tighten it down with a 10mm socket. And with that, we complete our spark plug replacement. Well, I hope you found this video helpful and informative. If so, please click that thumbs up button to support my video and my channel. And please subscribe if you haven't done so.